He just wanted to help a stranger at the station, but he lost his job. Days later, he found a girl playing a broken violin. What she revealed about her mother and their past led him to face unimaginable choices. Snow was falling slowly, covering the tracks with a white blanket that seemed to erase the traces of time. The platform of London's main station was almost deserted, with only the sound of a train disappearing into the distance. Jack, a 38-year-old train engineer, walked through the metal corridor, pulling his coat tighter against his chest to shield himself from the biting cold. He had just finished another night shift, as always, without any surprises. For Jack, each night felt like a repetition of the last: hurried passengers, mechanical noises, and the crushing silence when he returned home alone. But something about that night felt different. Jack stopped when he spotted a woman sitting on one of the benches on the platform. She was huddled, her shoulders curved, as if trying to hide from the world. She wore a coat too thin for the cold and clutched a worn suitcase, one of those that seemed to carry more memories than clothes. For a moment he hesitated. It wasn't uncommon to see homeless people in train stations. Many used the heated cars as temporary refuge, but this woman was different. Jack noticed the vacant look in her eyes, a chasm of sadness that seemed larger than the cold itself. Something within him compelled him to stop. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice echoing in the empty platform. The woman lifted her eyes, surprised. For a moment, Jack saw a mix of fear and shame on her face. She tried to compose herself, shaking her head in a gesture that seemed to mean yes. But the tremor in her hands contradicted her response. Jack looked around. There was no one else there. He remembered his mother, a woman who had worked tirelessly to raise him alone, often sacrificing her own comfort to protect him. She used to say, "Sometimes people just need someone to see them." "You don't look okay," he gently said, crouching to meet her gaze. "Do you want a coffee? Something to warm you up?" The woman shook her head again, but this time tears streamed down her face. She quickly wiped her eyes with the sleeves of her coat. Jack felt a knot in his throat. He didn't know what to do, but something held him back from simply turning away. He took off his own coat and draped it over her shoulders. I can't accept this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Of course you can," he replied. "You need it more than I do." He glanced at the clock. The last night train was about to leave. He knew the company rules forbade helping the homeless or allowing them to sleep in the cars, but at that moment, the rules felt insignificant. "Wait here," Jack said, standing up quickly. He walked over to the ticket machine and bought a ticket. When he returned, he handed it to her. "Take this train. You can rest there until morning. It's warm and safe." She looked at the ticket, then at Jack, her eyes filled with tears. "Why are you doing this?" Jack thought for a moment. He didn't exactly know. Perhaps it was the memory of his mother. Perhaps it was the emptiness he felt in his own life. "Because everyone deserves a little warmth," he replied. The woman held the ticket as if it were something precious. "Thank you," she murmured before getting up and walking toward the train. Jack watched as she disappeared through the doors of the carriage. The next morning, Jack was called into the office. The supervisor awaited him with a stern expression. "Jack, we received a report that you helped a homeless person at the station last night." Jack crossed his arms, trying to stay calm. "So what?" "You know this is against company policy," the supervisor said. "Our job is to ensure that the stations remain safe and organized. We can't allow people to use the cars as shelters." "She wasn't a threat, she just needed a place to rest," Jack tried to argue. "That doesn't matter," the supervisor said, handing him a piece of paper. "You're fired." Jack felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He had worked for the company for over a decade. The idea of losing his job for an act of kindness seemed absurd. He tried to protest, but the supervisor wouldn't budge. On his way home, Jack felt a mixture of anger and emptiness. The apartment was as cold as the station the night before. He took off his heavy coat and tossed it onto the sofa, running his hands over his face. No matter how hard he tried to justify his decision, he couldn't shake the doubt. Had he done the right thing? Or had he been naive to think that such a small gesture could make any difference? As he looked out the window, watching the snow continue to fall, Jack thought about the woman from the station. He didn't know her name or where she might be now, but for some reason that encounter felt more significant than anything he had done in recent years. Sometimes people just need someone to see them, he repeated to himself, as if his mother's words were a comfort. The emptiness he had felt for so long seemed to expand, but at the same time there was a spark of something new, something he couldn't quite define, but that made him want to find the woman again. Jack stood up and looked at the coat on the sofa. He knew that night hadn't ended at the station. Something was coming, and he felt he needed to be ready for it. Jack woke up that morning with a strange and unexpected purpose. He wasn't exactly sure what was driving him, but the emptiness he had felt since the night before now seemed filled with something more, a nearly desperate need to find the woman he had helped. He put on his heavy coat, hurriedly drank a cup of coffee, and left his home, the biting wind hitting his face as he walked toward the station. The platform looked different under the daylight. The flow of passengers was constant, but Jack noticed something he had never seen before: small groups of people on the fringes, aimless, seeming invisible to the rest of the world. He searched for Maggie in every corner of the station, walking back and forth for hours. He asked employees and even some homeless individuals, but no one seemed to know anything about her. Just when Jack was about to give up, a fragile sound caught his attention. It was music, or something trying to be music. He followed the sound until he found a small girl sitting on the ground near the entrance of the station. She was holding a worn-out violin, one of its strings broken, and was attempting to play it. The melody was disjointed, but there was something in it that made Jack stop. Beside her, an empty cup awaited coins that never came. Jack watched for a moment. The girl seemed oblivious to the world around her, focused on coaxing sounds from the broken instrument. He noticed she was barefoot, and her clothes were clearly insufficient for the cold. Her face, framed by messy brown hair, looked older than it should, as if she had seen more than a child ever should. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Hi," he said softly. The girl stopped playing and looked at him warily. "I don't have anything to give," she said, her voice firm despite her fragile figure. Jack smiled, crouching down to her level. "I'm not here to take anything, I just heard you playing. Are you alone?" She hesitated before answering. "My mom went to get food, she'll be back soon." Jack looked around, but he didn't see anyone who seemed to be taking care of her. "How long have you been here?" "I don't know," she replied, returning to fidgeting with the violin. "Sometimes she takes a while, but she always comes back." Jack felt his heart tighten. He pointed to the violin. "Can I see it?" The girl hesitated again, but handed him the instrument. Jack examined the violin carefully. It was old and battered, but it seemed like it used to be a good instrument at some point. He returned it gently. "You play well," he said, trying to break down the barrier between them. "I'm not as good as her," the girl said, looking at the ground. "Who?" "My mom." She stopped, as if she had said more than she intended. She looked up at Jack and added, as if wanting to justify herself, "She taught me before." Jack felt a jolt. He leaned in closer, his tone becoming softer. "What's your name?" "Emily." "Emily," he repeated, feeling the weight of that name. "Your mom, is her name Maggie?" Emily's eyes widened. "How do you know her name?" Jack took a deep breath. "I met her last night. She was at the station. I gave her my coat and bought her a ticket so she could rest." Emily looked confused, but also hopeful. "Do you know where she is?" Jack shook his head, feeling an inexplicable guilt for not having a better answer. "I don't know. I'm trying to find her too." Emily lowered her gaze, gripping the violin tightly. After a moment of silence, she said something Jack would never forget. "She always comes back, but sometimes it takes a while, because the world is too heavy for her to carry." Jack felt a lump in his throat. The maturity in Emily's voice, so incompatible with her age, hit him like a punch. He realized he couldn't just leave her there. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Emily looked at him suspiciously but finally nodded. Jack took Emily to his home, a small apartment with simple furniture and a sense of abandonment he had never noticed before. He seated her at the table and prepared something warm, canned soup and bread. Emily ate eagerly but in silence, as if she was used to not drawing attention. "Thank you," she said when she finished. "You're welcome," Jack replied, sitting across from her. He wanted to ask more about Maggie, but something held him back. He didn't want to pressure the girl. After a while, Emily began to explore the apartment with her eyes. They landed on a photograph in a simple frame on the shelf. It was a picture of Jack with an older woman, clearly his mother. "Who is she?" Jack looked at the photo, feeling a familiar ache in his chest. "My mum." "She looks nice," Emily said. "She was," Jack replied. "She did everything for me." Emily fell silent for a moment. "My mum also does everything for me. It's just that sometimes she can't." Jack didn't know what to say. He got up, took Emily's violin and started examining it. "This is pretty damaged. Do you want me to try to fix it?" Emily's eyes lit up. "You can fix violins?" "Not exactly," Jack admitted, "but I'm good with machines. Maybe I can do something." He spent the night trying to adjust the violin, replacing one of the strings with something improvised and tightening the loose parts. While he worked, Emily ended up falling asleep on the couch. Jack watched her for a moment, seeing how small and vulnerable she looked. The silence in his apartment had never felt so heavy, but now it seemed different. It wasn't emptiness, it was a reminder of something that was missing, something he needed to fill. When he finished adjusting the violin, Jack draped a blanket over Emily and sat in the armchair next to her. He held the violin for a moment, feeling the weight of the object in his hands. It wasn't just an instrument, it was a symbol of the connection between Emily and Maggie, something he now felt an almost desperate need to protect. That night, while Emily slept, Jack made a decision. He didn't know how or where, but he would find Maggie. It wasn't just about helping her, it was about something bigger, something he couldn't explain but that now seemed to give meaning to everything. Before we dive into the next chapter, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support is crucial for the growth of this channel and helps us bring more impactful stories. Now, let's continue with the journey. The next day, Jack left early, leaving Emily still asleep on the couch. He knew he needed answers, and the best lead he had was the shelter where Maggie used to stay. With the freshly repaired violin still vivid in his mind, he felt that each step he took brought him closer to understanding who the woman Emily called mother was, and why she had disappeared. The shelter was an old brick building, worn and weathered, with a discreet sign at the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was functional yet welcoming. Simple wooden tables, folded blankets, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. A group of people sat in chairs arranged in a circle, talking in hushed voices. Jack hesitated for a moment, feeling out of place, but approached the counter where a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a gentle smile was attending to someone. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yes," Jack replied, trying to sound calm. "I'm looking for information about a woman named Maggie. She used to stay here." The woman's smile faded slowly, replaced by an expression of caution. "Who are you? Why do you want to know?" "I met her recently," Jack explained. "She's missing and her daughter is under my care now. I want to help them, but I don't know much about her story." The woman studied Jack for a moment before nodding. "Wait here, I'll call Sarah, she can help you." A few minutes later, a young woman appeared. She was slender with brown hair tied back in a ponytail, wearing a vest with the shelter's logo and carrying a clipboard. "You're looking for Maggie?" Sarah asked, getting straight to the point. "Yes," Jack replied. "She's gone missing and I'm trying to understand how I can help." Sarah sighed, crossing her arms. "Maggie, she has a complicated story. She's a good person, but life has been cruel to her." "Can you tell me more?" Jack asked carefully. Sarah gestured for him to follow her to a table in the corner. They sat down and she began to speak, her voice heavy with empathy. Maggie was an incredible violinist, Sarah said. She played in an orchestra and had a promising future. But everything changed when she met a man named Daniel. Jack leaned forward, listening intently. Daniel was a businessman, and Maggie trusted him blindly. He promised to help her launch her solo career, but he ended up using her name in a financial fraud scheme. When everything came to light, Maggie was dragged into the scandal. She lost her reputation, her job, and all the money she had. Worse still, no one believed she wasn't involved. Jack felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He could imagine the weight of that betrayal. After that, Sarah continued, Maggie fell into depression. She tried to return to music, but the pressure and public humiliation were too much. She ended up distancing herself from everything, including Emily. Jack looked at Sarah, his heart heavy. And what happened after that? She ended up on the streets trying to survive. Maggie always talked about Emily. She said she wanted to be a better mother but didn't know where to start. Sometimes she would show up here at the shelter, but she never stayed long. It seemed like she was always running from something, or from herself. Do you know where she might be now? Sarah shook her head sadly. Unfortunately, no. Maggie has a habit of disappearing when things get tough, but she always ends up coming back eventually. Jack thanked Sarah for the information and left the shelter with a mix of emotions. Now he understood a bit more about Maggie, but that only made her situation more complex. He knew he needed to find her, but how? When Jack returned home, he found Emily sitting on the couch holding the violin. She was experimenting with the adjustments he had made, and though the notes were hesitant, there was something incredibly moving about the way she played. Jack paused at the door, watching. Emily was so focused that she didn't even notice he had arrived. The sound was simple but heavy with emotion, as if each note carried a piece of Maggie's story. "This is beautiful," Jack finally said, breaking the silence. Emily looked up, blushing a little. "I'm not as good as she is." "You're doing really well," Jack said, sitting down beside her. "What were you playing?" "A song my mom used to play for me," Emily replied. "She said it was the music that made everything less scary." Jack felt a lump in his throat. He couldn't help but think about what Sarah had said about Maggie. The image of a mother desperately trying to be strong for her daughter seemed to echo in the notes Emily played. "Emily," Jack said, choosing his words carefully. "Your mom, she loves you, you know that, right?" Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with a maturity that didn't match her age. "I know, but sometimes I think she loves me from a distance, like it's easier for her that way." Jack didn't know how to respond. He wanted to say that everything would be okay, but he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. Instead, he placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "I promise I'll do everything I can to find your mom," he said. Emily smiled faintly. "Thank you, Jack." That night, Jack began researching Daniel, the man who had ruined Maggie's life. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he felt it was the only concrete lead he had. He discovered some old news articles about the financial scandal, but Maggie's name was barely mentioned. It seemed her story had been forgotten, swallowed by time and the weight of the headlines. As he looked at Emily's violin, something struck him. Perhaps the key to finding Maggie wasn't in tracing her past, but in creating something that would draw her back. Jack grabbed a piece of paper and began jotting down ideas. He knew he needed something big enough to attract Maggie, something that would make her feel safe enough to return. After a while, he looked over at Emily, who was sleeping peacefully on the couch. The sound of the violin still echoed in his mind, and he realized that music might just be the answer. The morning was grey, and a light rain fell steadily when Jack heard a soft knock at the door. He was in the kitchen making coffee while Emily still slept on the couch, curled up next to her violin. The knock was so subtle that for a moment he thought he had imagined it. But then came another, a bit firmer, almost hesitant. Jack opened the door and was surprised to see Maggie standing there. She was drenched from the rain, with red, tired eyes. She looked smaller than he remembered, as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. "Maggie," he said, a mix of relief and concern in his voice. I needed to see Emily, she said, her voice breaking, but maybe it was a mistake. Jack opened the door wider, but Maggie hesitated before stepping inside, glancing around as if fearing judgment. Finally, she took a cautious step in, hugging herself as if trying to shield her heart. She looked at the couch and saw Emily sleeping, her face serene. The sight made tears roll down her cheeks. "Is she okay?" Maggie asked, almost in a whisper. "She misses you," Jack replied, "and she's waiting for you to come back." Maggie closed her eyes and shook her head. "I shouldn't be here. I'm no good for her. I just bring confusion and pain." "That's not true," Jack said, his voice firm. He placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to convey some form of security. "She just wants you. You don't have to be perfect. You just need to be present." Maggie stepped back, as if his touch was too much to bear. "You don't understand," she said, looking down at the floor. "I've failed so many times. I love her, but everything I do seems wrong. She deserves better than me." Jack felt a knot in his throat. He wanted to argue, but he knew that words wouldn't be enough to break the wall Maggie had built around herself. "Why don't you try talking to her?" he suggested. Maggie looked back at Emily, who was beginning to stir as if sensing her mother's presence. She took a hesitant step toward the couch. Emily opened her eyes and saw Maggie. For a moment she looked confused, as if she were dreaming, but then reality hit her, and she jumped off the couch. "Mom!" Emily shouted, running to embrace her. Maggie instinctively opened her arms, but at the last moment she pulled back. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling. Emily stopped, confused and hurt. "What's wrong? Why are you like this?" Maggie looked at her daughter with tear-filled eyes. I don't know how to do this, Emily. I don't know how to be a good mom." "But I just want you," Emily said, her childlike voice carrying a wisdom that belied her age. "It doesn't matter if you don't know everything. I just want you here." Maggie lowered her gaze, unable to hold her daughter's eyes. She turned to Jack as if seeking help, but he remained silent, waiting for her to confront the moment. "You don't understand, Emily," Maggie said, her voice almost breaking. "I've messed everything up so many times. If I stay, I might hurt you again." "You hurt me when you leave," Emily responded, simple and direct, as only a child could. The words struck Maggie like a blow. She took a step back, stumbling in her own guilt. Jack tried to intervene, but Maggie raised her hand, asking for a moment. After a heavy silence, Maggie took a deep breath and looked at Jack. "I need time," she said, more to herself than to him. "Time isn't what she needs," Jack said calmly. "She needs you." Maggie shook her head, as if she were engaged in an internal debate that no one else could hear. "I don't know how to stay without messing everything up." Before Jack could respond, Maggie turned to Emily. "I love you, Emily," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "More than you can imagine. But I don't know how to give you what you deserve." Emily tried to protest, but Maggie was already heading toward the door. "I'll come back," Maggie said, almost as a promise to herself. "I just need to fix a few things first." Jack saw the devastation on Emily's face as Maggie left through the door. He knew he couldn't force her to stay, but he felt frustration rising in his chest. After Maggie left, Jack found Emily sitting on the floor, hugging the violin as if it were a shield. He knelt down next to her, trying to find the right words. "She loves you, Emily," he said. "Then why doesn't she stay?" Emily asked, her voice choked with emotion. Jack didn't have an answer. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder, offering comfort in silence. That night, while Emily slept again on the couch, Jack sat at the kitchen table staring at the violin. He knew he had to do something to help Maggie find her way back, but for the first time, he felt the weight of that responsibility. He took a piece of paper and began to write, his ideas flowing freely. It wasn't just about bringing Maggie back. It was about showing her that she was enough, that she could be the mother Emily needed. The sun had timidly risen, filtering through the curtains of the living room as Jack placed 2 cups of tea on the table. Emily was on the couch, with her violin in her lap, her eyes still red from the previous night. She hadn't been speaking much since Maggie had left, but Jack could sense that something inside her was trying to reorganize, like pieces of a puzzle. Jack sat down in front of her, his hands holding one of the cups as if he needed the warmth to heat not only his body, but also his thoughts. He looked at the violin in her hands, and after a long moment of silence, he said, "Do you want to learn to play better?" Emily lifted her eyes to him, hesitant. "I don't know if I can." "I believe you can," Jack replied, "and I can help you. I'm not a musician, but I've always been good with my hands. We can figure it out together." The girl still seemed uncertain, but there was a glimmer of curiosity in her gaze. "My mom, she played like she was telling a story," Emily said, holding the violin more tightly. "I want to play like her." "Then let's get started," Jack said with a small but encouraging smile. Jack took the violin and tried to explain the basics to Emily, using the little he had learned from watching online tutorials the night before. He adjusted the positioning of her fingers, corrected her posture, and taught her how to hold the bow more firmly. At first, the sounds Emily produced were awkward, but she was a dedicated student. Each mistake seemed to fuel her determination even more. Jack noticed how she pressed her lips together and furrowed her brow, completely focused. "You're getting better," he said after an hour of practice. "Really?" Emily asked, doubt evident in her voice. "Definitely," Jack replied. "You have something that many people don't, passion. That's the most important thing." Emily smiled shyly. "Do you think my mom played well because she had passion?" "Absolutely," Jack said, trying to imagine Maggie playing with all her heart. "But you know what else helps? Practice. She must have practiced a lot to tell stories with her violin." Emily nodded, determined. "I'm going to practice until I can play like her." As the days went by, the violin sessions became a regular part of their routine. Emily was beginning to understand how notes could connect to create something greater. She experimented with different combinations, creating simple yet deeply emotional melodies. For Jack, these sessions were more than just a technical learning experience. They were a way to build something meaningful, not just for Emily, but also for himself. One night, while Emily slept, Jack found himself staring at a photograph of his mother. She was holding him in her lap at a park. Jack remembered that day well. They had gone out for a picnic after weeks of her working overtime at the hospital. "You are all I have, Jack," she had said that day, "and I promise to do my best for you even when it seems like I can't." The memory brought tears to Jack's eyes. He realized now that the strength of his mother was what had kept him steady all those years, and taking care of Emily was his way of honoring her. One afternoon during practice, Emily began playing something that sounded familiar to Jack. He didn't know where he recognized the melody from, but it had a melancholic tone that seemed to touch something deep within him. "That's beautiful," Jack said, pausing to listen. "What is it?" "I don't know," Emily replied, continuing to play. "I made it up. I think it's how I feel." Jack felt a knot in his throat. He realized Emily was expressing emotions that words could not reach. Each note seemed laden with a mix of longing, hope, and sadness. "You have talent," Jack said when she finished. Emily looked at him, surprised. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," he said. "You don't have to be perfect to play something beautiful. Sometimes it's the imperfections that make the music real." As Emily continued to develop her skills, Jack began to think about how this could help her reconnect with Maggie. He knew that music had a special power, a way to reach parts of the soul that words couldn't. One day he suggested something. "What do you think about composing a song for your mom?" Emily frowned. "I don't know how to do that." "You're already doing it," Jack said. "The music you play, the emotions you put into it, that's composing. Just bring it all together to create something that expresses what you feel." Emily thought for a moment before nodding. "Okay, I'll try." Weeks passed, and Emily's melody began to take shape. She practiced tirelessly, adjusting each note until it sounded just right. Jack helped her organize the parts, but the main work was hers. Meanwhile, Jack continued to grapple with his own traumas. He started writing in a notebook, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. The words flowed from his mind, often disordered, but honest. He wrote about his mother, about Maggie, about Emily. One night, while reading his notes, Jack realized something. He wasn't just helping Emily. She was helping him too. Her presence filled a void he hadn't even known existed, and the sound of the violin brought a peace he hadn't felt in years. Finally, the day arrived when Emily finished her composition. She was nervous, but Jack encouraged her to play for him. "This song is for my mom," Emily said before starting. As the first note sounded, Jack felt a shiver run down his spine. The music was simple, but it carried an impressive emotional depth. He could hear Emily's longing, her hope for reconnection, and her determination not to give up. When she finished, Jack had tears in his eyes. He applauded, a genuine smile on his face. "That was incredible," he said. "Do you think my mom would like it?" Emily asked, her eyes shining. "I think she would be very proud," Jack replied. It was a cold, quiet night when Jack heard another soft knock at the door. He was on the couch, reviewing his notes on how to help Emily reconnect with her mother. Emily was in her room, already asleep, exhausted after hours of practicing her composition. When Jack opened the door, Maggie stood there, exactly as he remembered her, but with something different in her eyes. This time there was not just the guilt or pain he expected to see. There was something more. Determination. "Can I come in?" Maggie asked, her voice hesitant. Jack nodded, stepping aside to give her space. Maggie entered and paused in the middle of the room, looking around as if searching for something or someone. "Emily is sleeping," Jack said, anticipating her question. Maggie sighed in relief, but also in worry. "I needed to come back," she finally said, as if responding to a question Jack hadn't asked yet. "But I don't know if I'm ready." Jack crossed his arms, studying her carefully. "What made you change your mind?" Maggie looked down at her hands, as if seeking courage there. "I realized I can't run away forever. But facing all of this, it's scary. I feel like I've lost the person I used to be. The violin was my voice, and when I lost that, I lost everything. My career, my daughter, even my identity." She paused, and when she lifted her eyes, tears were forming. "Without the violin, I didn't know who I was anymore, and without Emily, I'm just a shadow." Jack felt the weight of her words like a punch. He hesitated before speaking, choosing his words carefully. "You're still you, Maggie. Maybe you don't feel whole right now, but that doesn't mean you're lost. You just need to find your way back." Maggie shook her head, as if wanting to believe but still unsure. "What if I can't?" "You'll never know if you don't try," Jack said. He picked up Emily's violin, which was on the table, and extended it to Maggie. She instinctively recoiled. "No, I haven't played in years. I can't." "Yes, you can," Jack insisted. "You don't have to be perfect. You just need to start, for yourself and for Emily." Maggie sat down slowly, as if she were about to do something dangerous. She held the violin with trembling hands, almost as if the object were unfamiliar to her. She ran her fingers over the strings, testing them, and the low, rough sound filled the silence of the room. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath before positioning the bow. The first notes she played were hesitant, almost out of tune, as if they carried the weight of years of accumulated pain. Jack stood in silence, watching her every move. He realized that Maggie was struggling, not just with the instrument, but with what it represented. As she continued, the notes began to sound clearer. It wasn't an elaborate piece, but there was something deeply emotional in those simple notes. Each one seemed like an attempt to reconnect with a forgotten part of herself. Maggie suddenly stopped, lowering the violin. "It's not like it used to be," she said, her tone defeated. "It doesn't have to be," Jack replied. "What matters is that you started." She looked at him, tears finally escaping her eyes. "I want to believe I can be better for Emily, but what if I fail again?" Jack took a deep breath. Failing is part of it. But running away won't fix anything. You don't have to be perfect, Maggie. You just need to be here. As they talked, Emily appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of the violin. She stopped in her tracks upon seeing her mother with the instrument in hand, a mix of surprise and hope lighting up her face. Emily didn't say anything, but Maggie sensed her presence. She looked at her daughter, and the violin in her hands felt heavier than ever. "Mom," Emily said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Maggie tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. She set the violin down and reached out her hand to her daughter. Emily ran to her, hugging her tightly. "You're back," Emily said, crying. "I'm back," Maggie replied, squeezing her daughter close. "And I'll try, I promise I'll try." Jack watched the scene, feeling a lump in his throat. He knew that this moment was just the beginning, but he also understood it was an important step. In the following days, Maggie began spending more time with Emily and Jack. She was still full of doubts and fears, but Emily's presence seemed to give her new energy. Maggie started practicing the violin alone, usually at night when she thought no one could hear her. The notes were still hesitant, but there was a growing emotion in each sound she produced. One night, while Maggie was rehearsing in the living room, Emily heard her from the bedroom and couldn't hold back her tears. They weren't tears of sadness, but of hope. She knew her mother was fighting, and that was enough for her in that moment. Maggie also began opening up more to Jack. She shared more about her past, about how Daniel had destroyed her career and her trust in herself. "I trusted him," she said during one of those conversations. "He promised me the world, and I was naive enough to believe it. When everything fell apart, I blamed myself so much that I couldn't look in the mirror. And then I pushed Emily away because I thought she deserved better. I was wrong. I see that now, but it's still hard." Jack listened intently, not judging her. He knew what it was like to carry traumas and guilt, even if they were different from Maggie's. "Maggie," he said one night, "you've faced worse things, you survived, and now you're here trying. That's already a big step." She nodded, but the look in her eyes showed that there was still a long way to go. One afternoon, while Maggie was practicing, Jack suggested something unexpected. "Why don't you play with Emily?" Maggie froze. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "It's not about being ready," Jack said. "It's about trying." Emily, who had been listening, entered the room with her violin. "Please, Mom, let's play together." Maggie hesitated, but seeing the hope in Emily's eyes, she finally relented. The two began to play together, their melodies intertwining into something imperfect but incredibly beautiful. For Jack, it was like witnessing a conversation between mother and daughter, a conversation that didn't need words. When they finished, Maggie looked at Emily with tears in her eyes. "I will keep trying," she said, embracing her daughter. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. It means the world to us and helps the channel grow. Now let's move forward with the next chapter. The morning of the event arrived, wrapped in a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Emily was in the living room, adjusting her violin with trembling fingers, while Jack sat in the armchair trying to appear calm and confident. But he knew Emily was overwhelmed with anxiety. "You're going to crush it," Jack said, smiling with a confidence that felt genuine, but that he himself struggled to feel. "What if I mess up?" Emily asked, furrowing her brow as she adjusted the bow. "What if they don't like it?" "Emily," Jack said, leaning forward, "it's not about playing perfectly. It's about playing what's in your heart. This music is yours. No one can take that away from you." Emily managed a small smile, but nerves were still etched on her face. "Okay, I'll try." Maggie, who had been watching from the kitchen, observed everything from a distance. Since Jack had mentioned the event, she couldn't stop wondering if it had been a good idea. She knew Emily was talented, but feared that the weight of expectations might be too much for such a young girl. "You look beautiful," Maggie said, approaching Emily. Her voice was gentle yet laden with emotion. Emily looked at her mother, holding the violin more firmly. "I'm going to play for you, Mum." Maggie felt a lump in her throat. All she could do was nod, tears forming in her eyes. The community event was held in a small concert hall in the heart of the city. The walls were draped in red curtains that gave a warm feel to the space, while the stage, illuminated by soft lights, felt like a world apart. Jack parked the car and helped Emily out. Maggie hesitated before getting out, adjusting her coat as if she wanted to hide from the world. "You don't have to come, Mom," Emily said suddenly, noticing her mother's nervousness. "I know it's hard." Maggie shook her head. "No, I want to be here. I'll stay in the back." Emily nodded, understanding that this was the most her mother could offer at that moment. The hall was filled with families, friends, and eager musicians. Children of various ages held violins, flutes, and even guitars, while their parents whispered words of encouragement. The event began with simple but charming performances. A boy played the flute, while a girl recited a piano piece that drew warm applause from the audience. When it was Emily's turn, Jack noticed she was gripping the violin tighter than necessary. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Take a deep breath," he said. "You're here because you deserve to be. Show them who you are." Emily took a deep breath and walked up to the stage. Silence fell over the room as she took her position. Maggie, hiding at the back of the audience, held her hands tightly, her eyes fixed on her small, determined daughter. Her mind was filled with doubts. What if Emily failed? What if she was judged? But above all, Maggie feared that Emily wouldn't be able to bear the weight of her emotions. Emily began to play, and the first notes filled the room with a soft, melancholic melody. It was the piece she had composed for her mother, filled with longing, hope, and love. The melody seemed to tell a story, a journey of pain, struggle, and ultimately, reconnection. Maggie felt tears streaming down her face before she could stop them. Each note seemed to tear at pieces of her soul, exposing her failures and regrets, but also showcasing Emily's unwavering love. Jack, sitting further ahead, felt moved in a way he hadn't expected. He knew Emily was talented, but now he saw something more. She was using music to express everything she couldn't put into words. When Emily finished, there was a moment of absolute silence, as if the audience needed time to process what they had just heard. Then, the first applause came, followed by another, and soon everyone was on their feet, applauding warmly. Emily looked out at the audience, surprised and emotional. Her eyes searched for Jack, who was standing, applauding with a proud smile. Then she looked to the back of the room and found Maggie. Maggie hesitated, but then began to walk toward the stage. Each step felt harder than the last, but she knew she needed to go. When she reached Emily, she hugged her tightly. "You played like you were telling my story," Maggie said, her voice choked with emotion. Emily hugged her back, a shy smile on her face. "I made it for you, Mom." Maggie felt the tears returning, but this time they were of relief and hope. For the first time in years, she felt she could begin to forgive herself. After the event, families and musicians gathered in the lobby to celebrate. Maggie stood next to Emily, still trying to process everything that had happened. Jack approached, holding 2 cups of hot tea. "You were amazing, Emily," he said, handing one of the cups to Maggie. "Thank you, Jack," Emily said, her smile genuine. Maggie looked at Jack, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I'll never be able to thank you enough for everything you've done for us." Jack shook his head. "You both did this together. I was just here to support." Maggie smiled, but Jack saw something more in her eyes, a glimmer of strength that she hadn't had before. That night, back in the apartment, Maggie and Emily were sitting on the couch while Jack prepared something to eat. Emily picked up the violin and began to play again, this time a lighter, almost joyful melody. Maggie watched her, feeling more connected to her daughter than ever before. She knew there was still much work to be done, but for the first time, she felt she had a chance to rebuild what she had lost. When Emily finished, Maggie took the violin and started to play. The notes flowed more freely this time, as if she were letting go of part of the weight that had been holding her back. Emily joined in, and soon they were playing together, creating a melody that seemed full of hope. Jack stood in the kitchen doorway, watching silently. He knew that this moment was special and didn't want to interrupt. Instead, he let the music fill the apartment, bringing with it a sense of renewal. The morning was sunny, but the cold air matched Maggie's nervousness as she walked toward the shelter. Her hand trembled slightly as she pushed open the heavy door, which creaked in protest. The familiar sounds of murmuring voices and the smell of cheap coffee made her pause for a moment. This place had been both a refuge and a painful reminder of how far she had fallen. "Maggie!" Sarah's voice, the shelter's volunteer, pulled her from her thoughts. Sarah was behind the counter, organizing papers and wearing a warm smile. Maggie forced a smile and approached. "Hi, Sarah, I wanted to talk to you if you have time." Sarah set the papers aside and gestured to an empty table. "Of course, I always have time for you." The two sat down, and for a moment there was just silence. Maggie fidgeted with her hands, her fingers twisting the sleeves of her jacket. "I want to change," Maggie finally said, her voice low. "I want to find a job, rebuild my life, but I don't even know where to start." Sarah smiled, but carefully, as if she understood how fragile that moment was. "You've already taken the first step, Maggie. Recognizing that you want to change is the beginning of everything." Maggie nodded, but her eyes were still filled with doubt. What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough? "Everyone fails," Sarah said, her tone firm. "What matters is that you keep trying. Besides, you're not alone. You have Emily and now Jack, and you have me too." Those words seemed to ease something inside Maggie. For the first time in a long time, she felt a thread of hope. Sarah helped Maggie fill out a job application. Together, they updated Maggie's old resume, highlighting skills that could be useful. Sarah also suggested that Maggie start performing publicly again, perhaps at community events or by teaching children. "You have a talent that can change lives," Sarah said. "Why not use it to inspire others?" Maggie hesitated. The idea of re-entering the world as a violinist felt daunting, but at the same time there was something comforting about the possibility. In the following days, Maggie began to visit the shelter regularly, participating in workshops and helping others who were in tough situations. This work brought a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt in years. Jack, for his part, continued to offer unwavering support. He rearranged the apartment so that Maggie could have her own space. Although she still hesitated to accept help, Jack's kindness encouraged her. "You're not bothering me," he said one night while preparing dinner. "We're all in this together." Maggie looked at him with gratitude. "Thank you, Jack. I don't know what I would do without you." Meanwhile, Emily was flourishing. With Maggie now as her mentor, she began to develop her violin skills even further. Maggie taught her patiently, sharing techniques and stories from her own experiences. "When I played in the orchestra, I was always told to play from the heart," Maggie said during one of their impromptu lessons in the living room. "It doesn't matter if you hit a wrong note. What matters is making the music mean something." Emily smiled, absorbing every word. "I want to play like you, Mum." Maggie paused, her daughter's words echoing in her mind. For the first time, she felt she was leaving behind the shadow of her past and becoming someone Emily could admire. One afternoon, Maggie received an unexpected call. It was Sarah with news that made Maggie's heart race. "There's an opening for a music teacher at a community school," Sarah said. "They need someone to teach violin. I thought you might be interested." Maggie clutched the phone tightly. I don't know if I'm ready." "You'll never know until you try," Sarah replied firmly. "Besides, I'm sure Emily would love to see you teaching." Those words made Maggie reconsider. Maybe it was time to take that step. Jack insisted on driving her to the school on the day of the interview. Maggie was visibly nervous, adjusting her scarf repeatedly as the car moved through the city streets. "You're going to do great," Jack said, his tone encouraging. "They'll see how talented and passionate you are." And what if I mess everything up? Maggie asked, looking at Jack with concern. Then you learn from it and try again, he said. Those simple words had a surprising impact on Maggie. She took a deep breath and nodded, feeling a bit more confident. The interview went more smoothly than Maggie had expected. The school's principal, a kind man with grey hair and round glasses, seemed impressed by her story and her passion for music. He asked Maggie to play something to demonstrate her skills. Maggie hesitated for a moment, but then positioned the violin and began to play. The notes flowed smoothly, filling the room with a melody that seemed to tell her journey, the pain, the struggles, and finally the hope. When she finished, the principal smiled. "Welcome to the team, Maggie." Maggie felt tears streaming down her face as she shook his hand. It was more than a job, it was a symbol of her redemption. In the following weeks, Maggie began working at the school, teaching children who, like Emily, found refuge in music. Although she still faced moments of doubt, each lesson served as proof that she could overcome her fears. Emily, for her part, was happier than ever. She loved hearing the stories her mother told about her students and was increasingly inspired to play. One night, while they were together on the couch, Emily looked at Maggie and said, "You're different, Mum, happier." Maggie smiled, hugging her daughter. "It's because I finally feel like I'm finding my way." It was a cold, quiet night when Jack heard another soft knock at the door. He was on the couch, reviewing his notes on how to help Emily reconnect with her mother. Emily was in her room already asleep, exhausted after hours of practicing her composition. When Jack opened the door, Maggie stood there exactly as he remembered her, but with something different in her eyes. This time there was not just the guilt or pain he expected to see. There was something more, determination. "Can I come in?" Maggie asked, her voice hesitant. Jack nodded, stepping aside to give her space. Maggie entered and paused in the middle of the room, looking around as if searching for something or someone. "Emily is sleeping," Jack said, anticipating her question. Maggie sighed in relief, but also in worry. "I needed to come back," she finally said, as if responding to a question Jack hadn't asked yet. "But I don't know if I'm ready." Jack crossed his arms, studying her carefully. "What made you change your mind?" Maggie looked down at her hands, as if seeking courage there. "I realized I can't run away forever, but facing all of this, it's scary. I feel like I've lost the person I used to be. The violin was my voice, and when I lost that, I lost everything. My career, my daughter, even my identity." She paused, and when she lifted her eyes, tears were forming. "Without the violin, I didn't know who I was anymore. And without Emily, I'm just a shadow." Jack felt the weight of her words like a punch. He hesitated before speaking, choosing his words carefully. "You're still you, Maggie. Maybe you don't feel whole right now, but that doesn't mean you're lost. You just need to find your way back." Maggie shook her head, as if wanting to believe but still unsure. "What if I can't?" "You'll never know if you don't try," Jack said. He picked up Emily's violin, which was on the table, and extended it to Maggie. She instinctively recoiled. "No, I haven't played in years. I can't." "Yes, you can," Jack insisted. "You don't have to be perfect. You just need to start. For yourself and for Emily." Maggie sat down slowly, as if she were about to do something dangerous. She held the violin with trembling hands, almost as if the object were unfamiliar to her. She ran her fingers over the strings, testing them, and the low, rough sound filled the silence of the room. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath before positioning the bow. The first notes she played were hesitant, almost out of tune, as if they carried the weight of years of accumulated pain. Jack stood in silence, watching her every move. He realized that Maggie was struggling not just with the instrument, but with what it represented. As she continued, the notes began to sound clearer. It wasn't an elaborate piece, but there was something deeply emotional in those simple notes. Each one seemed like an attempt to reconnect with a forgotten part of herself. Maggie suddenly stopped, lowering the violin. "It's not like it used to be," she said, her tone defeated. "It doesn't have to be," Jack replied. "What matters is that you started." She looked at him, tears finally escaping her eyes. "I want to believe I can be better for Emily, but what if I fail again?" Jack took a deep breath. Failing is part of it, but running away won't fix anything. You don't have to be perfect, Maggie. You just need to be here. As they talked, Emily appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of the violin. She stopped in her tracks upon seeing her mother with the instrument in hand, a mix of surprise and hope lighting up her face. Emily didn't say anything, but Maggie sensed her presence. She looked at her daughter, and the violin in her hands felt heavier than ever. "Mom," Emily said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Maggie tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. She set the violin down and reached out her hand to her daughter. Emily ran to her, hugging her tightly. "You're back," Emily said, crying. "I'm back," Maggie replied, squeezing her daughter close. "And I'll try, I promise I'll try." Jack watched the scene, feeling a lump in his throat. He knew that this moment was just the beginning, but he also understood it was an important step. In the following days, Maggie began spending more time with Emily and Jack. She was still full of doubts and fears, but Emily's presence seemed to give her new energy. Maggie started practicing the violin alone, usually at night when she thought no one could hear her. The notes were still hesitant, but there was a growing emotion in each sound she produced. One night, while Maggie was rehearsing in the living room, Emily heard her from the bedroom and couldn't hold back her tears. They weren't tears of sadness, but of hope. She knew her mother was fighting, and that was enough for her in that moment. Maggie also began opening up more to Jack. She shared more about her past, about how Daniel had destroyed her career and her trust in herself. "I trusted him," she said during one of those conversations. "He promised me the world, and I was naive enough to believe it. When everything fell apart, I blamed myself so much that I couldn't look in the mirror. And then I pushed Emily away because I thought she deserved better. I was wrong, I see that now, but it's still hard." Jack listened intently, not judging her. He knew what it was like to carry traumas and guilt, even if they were different from Maggie's. "Maggie," he said one night, "you faced worse things, you survived, and now you're here trying. That's already a big step." She nodded, but the look in her eyes showed that there was still a long way to go. One afternoon, while Maggie was practicing, Jack suggested something unexpected. "Why don't you play with Emily?" Maggie froze. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "It's not about being ready," Jack said. "It's about trying." Emily, who had been listening, entered the room with her violin. "Please, Mom, let's play together." Maggie hesitated, but seeing the hope in Emily's eyes, she finally relented. The two began to play together, their melodies intertwining into something imperfect but incredibly beautiful. For Jack, it was like witnessing a conversation between mother and daughter, a conversation that didn't need words. When they finished, Maggie looked at Emily with tears in her eyes. "I will keep trying," she said, embracing her daughter. The sun shone softly in the autumn sky, casting a golden light over the small garden of the house. It was a peaceful day, with a gentle breeze causing fallen leaves to dance across the lawn. Jack sat in a wooden chair watching Maggie and Emily. He held a cup of coffee that was slowly cooling, but his attention was completely focused on the scene before him. Maggie was kneeling next to Emily, adjusting her daughter's fingers on the violin. They laughed together, their voices light like the music that would soon fill the air. Emily, now more confident, was attempting to play a cheerful melody she had invented. Even with a few notes out of place, the sound was full of life, a reflection of the journey they had lived. In the months since the benefit concert, the lives of Maggie, Emily, and Jack had changed significantly. After the success of the event, Maggie began receiving more invitations to perform at small concerts and community events. However, she chose to focus on the work that truly touched her heart, teaching violin to underprivileged children. "It's not just about music," she told Jack during one of their conversations. "It's about giving these kids something I lost, hope and purpose." Jack couldn't have been prouder. He watched Maggie blossom from a woman tormented by guilt into someone who inspired others. As Maggie rebuilt her life, Jack also took important steps. He made the decision to officially adopt Emily, a process that took months but brought indescribable joy to both of them. "You've always been like a dad to me," Emily said on the day the adoption was finalized. "Now it's for real." Jack hugged her, feeling an emotion he had never experienced before. He knew his life was complete in a way he had never imagined. The house they lived in now was modest but cozy. It was filled with little memories they were building together. Emily's violin in a corner of the living room, the flowers Maggie planted in the garden, and Jack's tools scattered across the garage, always ready to fix something. One afternoon, while Maggie was at school and Emily was in class, Jack found himself looking around the space, reflecting on all they had achieved. He thought about how, months earlier, his life felt like an empty cycle of work and loneliness. Now, there was laughter, music, and above all, love. In the garden, Emily finished playing her melody, a radiant smile on her face. Maggie clapped and gave her daughter a warm hug. "That was your best one yet," Maggie said, her eyes shining with pride. "Do you think I can play at the next school concert?" Emily asked hopefully. "I not only think so, I know you'll rock it," Maggie replied, kissing her daughter's forehead. Jack, watching their interaction, felt his heart warm. He got up from the chair and walked over to the two of them, wrapping his arms around them. "We have a real musician in the family," he joked. Emily laughed. "I had the best teachers." As the afternoon progressed, Maggie suggested they plant something together in the garden as a symbol of everything they had built. Jack grabbed a small sapling he had kept in the garage, and the three of them began digging a hole in the corner of the lawn. "This tree will grow and be as strong as we are," Maggie said as Emily tossed dirt around the roots. Jack looked at the two of them, feeling a peace he had never known before. He realized that the tree was not just a symbol of strength, but also of growth and renewal, exactly what they had experienced together. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Jack and Maggie sat on the porch watching the stars. The silence between them was comfortable, full of understanding. "You changed my life," Maggie suddenly said, looking at Jack. "I think we all changed each other's lives," he replied with a smile. Maggie turned to him, her eyes brimming with emotion. "I never thought I could find something like this, something so real." "Neither did I," Jack admitted. "But I guess it just proves that even when everything seems lost, there's always something waiting for us." They fell silent again, letting the words resonate between them. The next day, their usual routine resumed, but now it felt different. Every moment, no matter how simple, was filled with meaning. Their lives were not perfect. There were still challenges and uncertainties, but they had something unshakable: each other. By late afternoon, Emily picked up her violin again and began to play in the garden. Maggie and Jack joined her, listening as the music filled the air. It was a cheerful melody, full of hope and promise. Jack watched the two of them, feeling complete. He knew that life would still bring its ups and downs, but that didn't matter. They had found what truly mattered: a family. As the music came to an end, Jack looked at the newly planted tree in the corner of the garden. It was small and delicate, but he knew that with time and care it would grow strong and resilient, just like them. Even when everything seems lost, Jack thought, there's always a melody waiting to be played. And with that thought, he closed his eyes, letting the sound of Emily's violin fill the air, knowing that this moment was the beginning of something eternal. At the end of this emotional journey, we saw how the power of love, resilience, and reconnection can transform lives. The journey of Maggie, Jack, and Emily teaches us that even in the darkest moments, there is hope to rebuild what was broken. Whether it's facing the past, forgiving ourselves, or believing in the power of music and human connections, this story reminds us that it's always possible to start over. And you? In what areas of your life can you find the strength to start again, even when it feels impossible? What did you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next videos. Give it a like to help us bring more inspiring stories like this, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to check out the next recommended video now appearing on your screen. We have more incredible stories waiting for you. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of our community.